Welcome to video 25, where we look at inputs, algorithms and outputs. This is all part of computational thinking, and when we think of inputs as part of computational thinking, we need to make the distinction that when we're inputting data into a computer system, it is data that we are inputting. Data essentially is letters, numbers, spaces, symbols that have no meaning or no context. They could be jumbled up, numbers and letters, when we're looking at raw data. And we might recognize some things within some raw data, for example, some dates possibly, because of the way they're formatted, or even a person's name. But looking at raw data, it has no real meaning, has no context, has no use. So for example, a basic input form like the one shown has some data within there that's been entered by somebody, but at this point the computer doesn't have an idea about what that data is really for. It's just being entered and it will be stored somewhere, and nothing will happen to that data to make it useful until some processing is done to it. And this is even more so the case with things like automatic input. So if we imagine a weather station, everything that goes into the computer that's attached to that anemometer will be raw data. It might be dates, times and wind speed measurements, but to the human eye, if we were to look at that raw data, it may not make much sense. When we talk about outputs, we need to make the distinction that we output information from a computer system, and information is different from data. We said that data has no meaning, and looking at some raw data we might not understand it. We want to get information out from a computer because information is useful. It is data that has been processed and put into context, something that we can is meaningful to us and we can make use of, such as a report from a database, for example. So the data we saw being entered, the raw data we saw being entered on the previous screen using an input form, could be queried, filtered, presented nicely into some information here. Customer purchases over £10 that we might find useful. That is information being outputted. And another type of output from an automatic system could be something like the weather. So that raw data that was input into weather measuring devices could be output into something that we're more used to and is meaningful to us, such as what we see on the screen, the weather map. So how do we get from data to information? How does the computer turn meaningless data into useful information? Well, it will do some sort of processing, and to do that processing it needs an algorithm. These are the step-by-step instructions needed to solve a problem. And if we look at this diagram on the right, that is a flowchart representation of an algorithm for making a cup of tea. This is a diagram that you might have seen from previous studies, in that we input data into a computer, the computer processes it using its algorithms and outputs some useful information. So what are the key things that you'd need to know for an exam? Well, in an exam you might be given a scenario, and from that scenario, from that business problem you're presented with, you might have to identify some inputs to a solution, and possibly the data types for those inputs, and also to identify some outputs. So if the scenario was an air conditioning system, for example, our inputs might be a temperature sensor such as a thermostat, user controls, so there'll be buttons possibly on the panel of the system that allows the user to set the temperature, add a timer, etc. In terms of outputs, well, the output from an air conditioning system is the control that controls the temperature of the air to give out cool air usually. But there'd also be an on-screen display showing the current temperature and showing the settings that the user had input. In terms of data types, for something like a thermostat, it probably measures temperature using a decimal data type because it needs to be able to store decimal places. If you're not sure about these types of data yet, then you will be in the future for sure. So decimal data type for temperature sensor. User controls, they're likely to only set temperature to the nearest degree, so an integer would be a good data type for temperature, and date time would be a good data type to be able to log when the user wants the air conditioning to work. So that's inputs, algorithms and outputs. See you next time.